She was 16 years old. The spring her uncle put her out of the only house she had ever called home, and she stood at the muddy end of Sabbath Row in the town of Larkspur, Wyoming, with a carpetbag, a dead mother's thimble, and $4.60 twisted into the corner of a flour sack apron. Her uncle, Harlan Pike, who kept the town's only bank and the town's only good coat, had told the whole congregation she was willful and ungrateful, and by supper time not one door on that street would open to her knock. With what little she had, she bought the one thing no one else in Larkspur would touch: a collapsed, weed-choked root cellar dug into the hill behind the burned Kell homestead, sold to her for $3 flat by a clerk who laughed as he took the money. It was a foolish, desperate purchase, a hole in the ground bought by a girl with nowhere to sleep. Yet beneath its rotting boards, under a false floor no one had thought to lift in 11 years, lay something a quiet man had sealed away before he died. Something that would not only remake her life, but give back to Larkspur everything a thief had taken from it. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Delia Wren. If you are watching tonight from a place that feels forgotten, from a town that turned its back on you, or a house that stopped calling you by your name, stay with us a while and tell us in the comments where you are watching from, because this story was made for you. To understand the girl who stood in that mud, you must first understand the mother she had lost and the years that made her, for Delia Wren was not born to hardship, only delivered to it. Her father, Thomas Wren, had come west from Ohio in the years after the war with a wagon of tools and a wife named Corinne, and for a while, in the green fold of country the Cheyenne had called the place of running water, the Wrens had made something modest and good. Thomas was a joiner and a fixer of things, a man who could look at a broken churn or a sprung wagon wheel and understand, the way some men understand Scripture, exactly how it had meant to work before it failed. He taught his daughter at his knee, and though the neighbors thought it strange to hand a girl a plane and a chisel, Corinne only smiled and said, "A mind that can mend does not care whose hands it wears." So Delia grew up learning the grain of oak and the give of green pine, learning that a thing that seemed ruined was most often only misunderstood, that patience and a straight eye could bring back what carelessness had thrown away. She learned to listen to wood the way her mother listened to people, tapping a board to hear whether the rot ran deep or only skinned the surface. And by the time she was 10, she could tell you which of the town's fine-looking fences would stand the winter and which would fall. Her mother taught her the other half of what she would need, though neither of them knew then how badly she would need it. Corinne Wren kept the accounts for the little farm in a slow, careful hand, and she taught Delia her letters and her figures at the kitchen table by tallow light. And she taught her something rarer still, that numbers do not lie, that a column of figures is a kind of conscience, and that anyone who tells you the sums are too complicated for you to follow is usually a man hoping you will not follow them. Keep your own ledger, Corinne told her more than once, even if it is only scratched on a shingle, because the day may come when your word is doubted and only your figures will speak for you. Delia did not understand it then. She kept a child's ledger of eggs gathered and berries picked because it pleased her mother, and she filled it out in a round, earnest hand, and she had no notion that the habit would one day be the difference between justice and ruin for an entire town. But the fever came the autumn. Delia turned 12, moving down the valley from farm to farm like a slow gray tide, and it took Corinne in 9 days and left Thomas Wren hollowed out and half a man. He did not drink, and he did not curse the sky. He simply folded inward, the way a house folds when a center beam is pulled, and the farm folded with him. Debts he had always meant to pay came due, and the only man in Larkspur with money to lend was Corinne's own brother, Harlan Pike, who wore a black coat and a gold watch chain, and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. Pike lent his grieving brother-in-law money against the farm, and spoke gentle words at the graveside. And all the while, we would later learn, he was already counting the acres as his own. When Thomas Wren followed his wife into the ground 2 winters later, worn out at 40 by grief more than by any illness a doctor could name, he left behind a 14-year-old daughter and a stack of papers he had trusted his wife's brother to keep honest. That trust was the last mistake of a good man's life. Harlan Pike took Delia into his fine house on Sabbath Row, and to the town it looked like Christian charity, the prosperous uncle sheltering the orphan niece. But there is a kind of shelter that is only a longer way of being cast out, and Delia learned it quickly. In Pike's house, she was not a daughter but an unpaid girl, up before the stove was cold to black the grates and haul the water, sent to bed after the last dish was dried, spoken of at church as a burden borne bravely. Her uncle had taken the Wren farm to settle her father's debts. Debts, she came to suspect, that had been fattened in the dark by a banker's pen. And he had sold the land and pocketed the difference and told everyone the poor girl had been left with nothing. What galled him, what he could never forgive, was that Delia was not stupid. She had her mother's eye for figures, and she saw the way the numbers moved in that house, and once, only once, at 15, she asked him plainly why her father's farm had sold for so much, and her father's debt had somehow swallowed all of it. Harlan Pike went white, and then he went cold, and from that day she was a marked girl in her own uncle's home. The fall, when it came at last, came fast, the way a rotten limb gives all at once, though the rot has been years in the working. It was the spring. Delia turned 16, and a widow named Ada Muncie had come to Pike's bank to beg for time on her mortgage. And Delia, carrying a tray, had heard her uncle refuse in that gentle, terrible voice of his, and had seen the widow leave weeping. Something in the girl would not lie down. That evening she went into her uncle's study while he was at his supper, and she opened his great ledger, the one bound in black calf that he kept locked, though a girl who understands the grain of wood understands also the weakness of a cheap lock. She did not steal a penny. She only read, and read fast, her mother's training singing in her blood, and in 20 minutes she understood what Harlan Pike had spent a decade building. She saw two sets of figures where there should have been one, the true sums a family owed, and the swollen sums Pike recorded and collected, the difference vanishing into his own accounts. She saw her father's name. She saw the widow, Muncie's. She saw a dozen more. She was still standing there, the lamp trembling in her hand, when her uncle came in. He did not shout. Harlan Pike never shouted. That was the horror of him. He took the ledger from her hands, and he looked at her for a long, still moment, and then he told her, in the same voice he used to bless the meal, that she was a thief and a liar and a girl of low and grasping character, that she had been caught prying into what did not concern her, and that he would not have such a serpent under his roof another night. He called for his wife and his hired man to witness it, and he put her out the front door onto Sabbath Row with her carpet bag already packed. It had been packed, she understood later. Before she ever opened the ledger, he had only been waiting for a reason the town would believe. By morning, the story was all over Larkspur. The ungrateful Wren girl, caught stealing from the good uncle who had taken her in, turned out at last, and wasn't it a shame? And hadn't he been a saint to keep her so long? Doors that had smiled at her father closed against her. The minister looked through her, and Delia Wren stood at the muddy end of the street with $4.60, and understood that in the eyes of Larkspur she was already gone. She did not weep, or not where anyone could see. She walked out past the last houses to where the burned Kell place stood on its hill, a black-ribbed ruin the town had left to the weeds for 11 years, because the fire that took the house had a bad name to it, and folk are quick to leave a cursed thing alone. Behind the ruined house, set into the hillside, was the old root cellar, its door hanging by one hinge, its stone and timber roof half sunk under a scab of grass and thistle. Delia knew the place by reputation only. Old Amos Kell had lived there alone, a quiet, dark-skinned man who had come to the territory no one knew from where, who kept to himself and paid his debts in coin and spoke to almost no one but the children, to whom he was unaccountably kind. He had died in the fire that took his house, and the town had shaken its head and said the hermit had likely upset his own lamp and had let the land go for taxes, and no one had ever wanted it. When Delia went back into town that same day, hollow-eyed and steady, and asked the county clerk what the cheapest piece of property in Larkspur might be, he laughed until he coughed and said the old Kell cellar could be had for $3 if she was fool enough to want a hole in a cursed hill. She counted $3 onto his counter. He stopped laughing. She signed her name Delia Wren in her mother's careful hand and walked back out to the only thing in the world that was now her own. That first night she slept in the cellar because she had nowhere else, and it was a wretched place to sleep, damp and close and smelling of 11 years of rot. The shelves collapsed, The floor, a filth of rotted potatoes gone to black liquor and mouse-chewed sacking. But Delia Wren was her father's daughter, and a girl who has been taught to see past ruin does not lie down and die in it. In the gray morning, she went to work with the only tools she had, her 2 hands and a broken spade she found rusting in the weeds, and she began to clean out the place she had bought, because it was hers, and because work was the one thing that had never once turned its back on her. She hauled out the rotted shelving and the black muck and scrubbed the stone with creek, water, and sand. And as she worked, she felt the old cellar begin, slowly, to answer her the way wood always had to shed its ruin and show its bones. And it was on the second day, on her knees prying up the last of the sodden floorboards to let the ground dry, that her chisel struck something that did not sound like earth. She had spent her life listening to the voices of made things, and she knew at once that this was wrong. The floor of a root cellar is packed dirt. Her father had built 2 of them, and she knew it in her hands. But under the rotted boards in the deepest corner, where the shelving had hidden it, was not dirt at all. Her chisel had rung on wood, planed, fitted, deliberate wood, laid level and true and then buried, as though a careful man had built a second floor beneath the first and then hidden that he had done it. Delia sat back on her heels in the lamplight, her heart going hard, and she ran her fingers along the seam and understood that she was looking at a false floor, joined so cleverly that only someone who spoke the language of joinery would ever have found the join. Whoever had made this had wanted it never to be found by careless hands. But Delia Wren's hands were not careless. They were the most careful hands in Larkspur, and they had been made careful for exactly this, though neither she nor the dead man who laid these boards could have known it. It took her the better part of a day to lift that floor without breaking it, for she would not splinter another person's careful work. And when at last the fitted panel came up, the smell that rose was not rot, but cedar, the clean, dry, resinous breath of good cedar, which does not decay and does not let the damp in, and which a wise man uses to keep safe the things he means to last. Below the false floor was a cedar-lined chamber no bigger than a grave, dry as a bone after 11 wet years, and in it lay the life that Amos Kell had hidden before he died. There was an oilcloth-wrapped bundle, and there was a small iron strongbox, and there was, laid carefully on top where it would be found first, a packet of letters bound in waxed string, and a single folded sheet of paper with 2 words written on the outside in a strong, plain hand. For whoever? Delia's fingers shook as she unfolded that sheet, and she read, by lamplight, the voice of a dead man reaching across 11 years. "My name is Amos Kell," it began, "and if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have found what I could trust no living soul in Larkspur to keep. I was born a slave in Missouri, and I bought my own freedom with these 2 hands, and I came west to be no man's property and no man's fool. I made my money honest, in gold, panning the high creeks that others gave up on, for I have patience and I do not quit a thing others quit. But there is a man in this town who has learned what I have, and he means to have it. And a black man alone in Larkspur has no law that will take his word over a white banker's. So I have hidden it, and I have written down the truth, that it might do some good for someone after I am past his reach. The man's name is Harlan Pike." She had to set the letter down. Out of the whole wide territory, out of all the ruined places in the world she might have crawled into to die, she had bought the one that held the truth about the man who had destroyed her, hidden by another soul that same man had ruined. It did not feel like chance. It felt, as she knelt there in the cedar-scented dark, like something her mother might have called by a gentler name than luck. She read on, deep into the night, and the whole of it came clear. Amos Kell had been no hermit at heart, but a careful, watchful man, and in his years of quiet in Larkspur he had seen Harlan Pike for exactly what he was. More than that, Kell had, in his patient way, kept records. The oilcloth bundle held a ledger of his own, and in it, in a hand as neat as Corrine Wren's had ever been, Amos Kell had copied out over the years every fact he could gather about the banker's dealings, the true debts of his neighbors, and the false sums Pike recorded against them, the names of families squeezed off their land, the dates and the amounts, a shadow ledger, built in secret by a man who knew he might not live to use it. Pike had come to Kell at the last, the letter said, offering to buy his claim for 1/10 its worth, and hinting at what might befall a friendless man who refused. and Kell had refused. And 3 weeks later, his house had burned in the night, with the town too quick to call it an accident. But Kell had already hidden his gold, and his ledger, and his letters beneath the false floor of the one place a fire could not reach, the stone cellar in the hill, and he had trusted, with the strange faith of a man who had every reason to trust nothing, that the truth would keep in the cedar dark until the right hands came for it. In the iron strongbox was the gold, not a dragon's hoard, but more money than Delia had ever seen or imagined. Honest gold panned grain by grain from creeks other men had abandoned, near $2,000 in coin and dust, a lifetime of patience turned solid and bright. And the letters, the waxed packet, were the last piece, and in some ways, the dearest. They were letters Amos Kell had written and never sent, to a sister named Hattie, still living, he believed, in Missouri, the last of his blood, telling her he was well and that he thought of her. Letters a man writes when he has no one else to be gentle with. Delia read them last, and it was the letters and not the gold that broke her open at last and let her weep for a whole night, for her mother and her father, and for the lonely, upright dead man whose secret she now carried, and for herself, 16, and cast out and holding in her two careful hands the ruin of the very man who had cast her. For she understood exactly what she was holding. In Amos Kell's shadow ledger, cross-read against what she had seen in her uncle's black calf book in the 20 minutes before he caught her, was proof real, dated, doubled proof, one honest record checking the other that Harlan Pike was a thief on a scale the town could not have dreamed. It was enough, she knew, to take back everything. And a lesser soul, a soul that had been starved and shamed and thrown into the mud, might have taken the gold and slipped away in the night to some far city and left cursed Larkspur to rot. There were long hours in the days that followed when Delia Wren considered exactly that, and no one who has walked in her shoes should judge her for it. But her mother's voice was in her still numbers do not lie, and neither, in the end, would she, and so was the voice of a dead man who had trusted whoever found his floor to do some good with it. She was not raised to run. She was raised to mend. She could not go to the law in Larkspur, for the county judge dined at Pike's table, and the sheriff owed the bank his house. She was a 16-year-old girl. The whole town believed a thief, holding accusations against its richest man. She knew as well as Amos Kell had known that her word alone would be laughed back into the mud. So Delia did what the wood had taught her and what her mother had taught her. She went slowly, and she went carefully, and she built her case joint by joint the way her father built a door, so that when it was finished it would be true and it would hold. She kept living in the cellar and told no one what she had found. She took 2 gold coins only and no more, and let it be known she had found day, work, and she bought a decent dress and a ledger book and rail fare, and she began quietly to gather the last pieces she needed. First, she wrote to Missouri, to the sister, Hattie Kell, and it took 3 months and 4 letters through the Freedmen's Church networks before a reply came in a wavering hand. Yes, Hattie lived, old now and poor, and yes, she had a brother Amos gone west, and never heard from these dozen years, and long feared dead, and she wept, she wrote, to know at last what had become of him. Delia sent her one of the unsent letters, and the news of the gold that was hers by blood, and the promise that it was coming to her. Then Delia rode the rail 2 days to the territorial capital, to a United States Marshal's office and a newspaperman she had chosen because his paper had once been sued by Harlan Pike and had no love for him, and she laid before them, in her mother's careful figures, the 2 ledgers side by side, the dead man's shadow record, and her own sworn account of what she had read in Pike's locked book, and the letter in Kell's hand naming his killer, and the strong box gold that proved the man had been robbed of a fortune worth killing for. Word travels, in a country as wide and hungry for news as that one was, and word of what a cast-out girl had found beneath a cursed hill began to travel faster than Harlan Pike could stop it. He tried. When he understood that Delia Wren was not gone but living out on the Kell place and asking questions, he moved against her the only ways he knew. He put it about that she had gone mad, that grief and shame had turned her simple, that any papers the poor creature waved about were forgeries a jealous girl had cooked up to slander her benefactor. He sent his hired man to frighten her, and found her cellar door barred with oak she had hung herself, true and strong, and the girl behind it unafraid. He went to the county judge and had a paper drawn to take the Kell land back for some invented flaw in the sale, meaning to get his hands on the hill and whatever was under it before the truth could root. And when at last he learned that a territorial marshal was asking after him and a newspaper was setting type, Harlan Pike did what such men do when the ground shifts. He prepared to gather what he could carry and be gone before the reckoning came. For a coward's courage lasts exactly as long as his advantage. But Delia had built her door too well, and it held. The marshal came to Larkspur on a bright, cold morning with the newspaperman beside him and the 2 ledgers in a leather case, and he did not come quietly. He called the town to the church that had shut its doors on Delia Wren, and before the same congregation that had believed every word against her, he laid out the truth. He read Amos Kell's letter aloud in the still sanctuary, the voice of the murdered hermit filling the room where his killer sat frozen in the front pew. He showed the doubled figures, the dead man's honest record and the girl's sworn account agreeing to the penny, so plain that even those who could barely cipher could see 2 truths pointing at one lie. He named the families Pike had robbed the Muncie widow, and a dozen more, and Thomas Wren, whose farm had been stolen from his orphan child under color of debt. And one by one, as the reading went on, the people of Larkspur turned in their seats to look at the black-coated man who had told them for 11 years what to believe. And Delia Wren, standing at the back in her plain, decent dress, watched the town's face change and did not gloat. For there is no joy in watching people learn how easily they were led. Harlan Pike was arrested that morning in the aisle of his own church, and though the wheels of the law turned slowly, they turned. The bank's true books were seized, and the extent of his thieving laid bare, and in time he was sent east to a federal prison to serve out years enough that Larkspur would not see his face again, his fine house sold, his gold watch chain gone. The old suspicion about the Kell fire was reopened too, and though the years had swallowed the certain proof, no one in Larkspur ever again spoke of Amos Kell as a careless deferred who had burned himself out of the world. They spoke of him, when they spoke of him at all, with the lowered voice owed to a man who was wronged and did not deserve it. That was its own kind of justice, the quiet kind, the kind that comes not with thunder but with a whole town finally seeing straight. And here is the thing that made Delia Wren more than merely vindicated. The thing the people of Larkspur would tell their grandchildren about long after the details of the crime had faded. She did not keep it for herself. The gold in the cedar chamber, near $2,000 in honest coin, was Amos Kell's, and she made certain the bulk of it went where he had wanted it to his sister Hattie in Missouri, brought west by rail at Delia's own arranging, an old woman weeping on a station platform to be handed her dead brother's fortune and his last unsent letters by a straight-backed girl who asked nothing for herself. But there was Kell's shadow ledger too, and in it the exact record of every family Harlan Pike had cheated, down to the dollar, and Delia took that ledger to the marshal and the court and would not rest until the monies recovered from Pike's estate were paid back to the people they had been stolen from. The widow Muncie kept her house. 3 families who had been squeezed off their land had their deeds restored, and the Wren farm, her father's farm, the green fold of running water country where a joiner had once taught his daughter the grain of oak that came back too, and Delia Wren walked its fence lines at 17 a landholder in her own right, having taken back with patience and figures what had been stolen with a pen. She did not sell the cursed hill or the cellar that had saved her. She rebuilt the Kell homestead with her own hands, and hired hands she paid fair, and she set a carved cedar marker where Amos Kell had died, and she opened on that land a thing Larkspur had never had, a small, plain workshop and school, where she taught any child who would come, girls and boys alike, the 2 things that had carried her through the mud: how to mend what others throw away, and how to keep an honest set of books, so that no gentle-voiced man in a black coat could ever again tell them the sums were too hard for them to follow. The children of the freedmen's families came, and the widows' children, and in time even the children of those who had shut their doors on her, and Delia Wren turned no one away, for she had learned in a cedar-lined dark that value hides in the places the careless refuse to look, and she had decided to spend her life teaching others to look. She was 16 years old the spring her uncle put her out of the only home she had known, and she stood at the muddy end of Sabbath Row with $4.60 and not one door in Larkspur that would open to her. Remember her there, because that is where the world wrote her off a foolish, ruined girl who had thrown her last coins away on a hole in a cursed hill. But the world reads only the surface, and Delia Wren had been taught by a joiner and a bookkeeper to read what lies beneath. Under the false floor that a wronged and careful man had built in the dark, she found not only the gold that freed his blood and the truth that felled her enemy, but the deeper thing, the thing the title of every life like hers points toward, that nothing honest is ever truly lost, only hidden, waiting for hands patient enough to lift the floor. She did not use what she found to become the thing that had hurt her. She used it to mend a broken town, to give a dead man back his good name, and to give a forgotten people back what was theirs. And that is why, in Larkspur, they no longer tell the story of the girl who was thrown out. They tell the story of the girl who came back and made them whole. Thank you for staying with us to the end of this one. It means more than you know to sit with a story all the way through in a world that hurries past everything. If Delia's story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear that being cast aside is not the same as being finished. And tell us in the comments, what is a time in your own life when you found real value in something or someone that everybody else had written off? We read every answer, and we carry them with us into the next story. Until next time, keep looking beneath the surface, be gentle with the overlooked, and stay close.